Part 3, Conquest, Chapter 7. The great hall of the palace had been turned into a laboratory. By some incredible means, the proc had managed to obtain all the things the professor asked for. The professor was stunned when he entered the hall for the first time. The vast, normally empty room was now filled with the most modern scientific equipment, plus benches, chairs, blackboards, bottles, and tubes of every description. But where did you get all this? How could you possibly manage it? The proc looked a little smug. I borrowed it. You borrowed it? From your laboratory at the university. What? Don't worry. I'll put it all back. You do your job, I'll do mine. The palace was bustling with excitement. Everyone had been advised of the remarkable experiment that was being conducted. As a result, the professor was given the utmost respect and attention. He began to work. The children wisely left him alone, but towards the end of the first day, they did peek in on him just to make sure that he was all right. They found him seated on a high stool, his head in his hands. Sheets of paper were scattered all over the floor. A waste paper bin was full to overflowing. The blackboard was covered with formulas. Lindy touched the professor's arm. Everything all right? She whispered. Oh, my dears, I'd quite forgotten about you. He seemed very distracted and rubbed his eyes wearily. I just don't seem to be able to get anywhere, he sighed. It will take a miracle. It's a miracle that we're here, Tom reminded him. Yes, remember what you said about that, added Ben. You said that miracles only happen after a lot of endeavor. A mind has to be ready and open before a miracle can happen. But that's just it, the professor replied desperately. That's the problem. Right now, my mind isn't open. I've been sitting here thinking so hard. I realize now why I wasn't able to cross the bridge, why I couldn't see it. I was torn between two worlds. I was preoccupied with my forthcoming journey to Washington, and I was worried about finishing my paper. I always worry if my work is not completed. So the real world was fighting with the worlds of my imagination. My concentration was hopelessly ruined. Well, if you realize all that, can't you make it right? Ben said simply. The professor was annoyed. Do you have any idea of the magnitude of this miracle you're asking for? I couldn't see the bridge, yet you're asking me to make a Whangdoodle. I know what you need, Lindy said in her practical voice. You need a scrappy cap. That's it, cried Tom. It would help you concentrate. Great idea. Come on, we'll go and ask the proc about it. They rushed towards the door. No, children, wait, the professor called after them, but they had gone. A short time later, the proc arrived. He placed Lindy's bonnet on the workbench. Having a few problems? A few? That's a masterpiece of an understatement. We'll try the bonnet. It might work. Oh, come on, my good fellow. The professor looked impatient. You know as well as I do that those hats mean nothing. They're not magic at all. They're not? Of course not. They are just a device, something for children to believe in, to help them bridge the gap. The proc gave a small smile. Well, they obviously work very well for them. I wouldn't underestimate those hats if I were you. I don't follow. It's quite simple. You say the hats are not magic, yet the fact is that without them, the children would never have believed enough to get to Whangdoodle Land. As you pointed out, by wearing the hats, they were able to bridge the gap. Obviously, you're having a lot of problems now. You're trying to bridge a gap, too. It would seem to me that Miss Lindy has a sensible idea. Try the hat. What have you got to lose? The professor banged his fist on the table. But I'm telling you, the hats are just a contrivance. There's nothing special about them. If you say so. The proc was irritatingly calm. He eased himself to the door with his long gliding walk. See you later. Proc, what if this experiment is a failure? Supposing I don't succeed? The proc opened the door. I suggest we wait and see how you get on. If I don't make another Whangdoodle, you're not going to give us the hats, are you? You intend to keep us here. You're not going to let us go at all. But how can I possibly keep you here? The proc replied innocently. You just said that the hats mean nothing. I couldn't stop you from leaving. Yes, but you know the children believe. Right now, the children are having a grand time and couldn't care less about going home. I suggest you stop worrying about them and concentrate on making a Whangdoodle for His Majesty. Plenty of time later to talk of going home. He quietly left the room. The professor stared after him and thought for the umpteenth time that the proc was a maddening fellow. He sighed deeply and looked at Lindy's hat on the workbench. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands. In the olden days, people really believed that magic emanated from the hat. They believed in the hat just as much as they believed in the Whangdoodle. Ben and Tom and Lindy certainly believed that the hats were the reason for their success. Was it possible? Could he have underestimated the scrappy caps? Were they magic after all? The professor considered the possibility and very slowly put the bonnet on his head and tied the ribbon under his chin or beneath his chin. He sat still and waited. There was an uncanny light in the great hall, but he was used to that. His years of practice had taught him that any period of sustained concentration brought with it feeling of bright, strong light. The children had discovered that also. He looked around the laboratory at the familiar equipment and at his notes and equations. He rested his chin on his hands and thought about the Whangdoodle. Quite suddenly, it happened. A strange sensation crept over him. There was a feeling of lightness, as if a great weight were being lifted from his shoulders. He forgot about the children and the proc. Thoughts and ideas flooded into his mind like the water that raced down the hillsides to join the Golden River. The professor reached for a pad and pencil and began to write as fast as he could. Hours later, the big double doors to the great hall opened. The Whangdoodle peeped into the room. "Hi there," he said with a shy grin. "I just couldn't keep away any longer. How's it all going?" The professor was wildly busy. Clouds of steam billowed from a pan at one end of the room. Several flasks containing colored liquids were bubbling noisily. The professor's spectacles were on the very tip of his nose. He was scribbling furiously on the blackboard. The Whangdoodle crept forward and peered over his shoulder. He made noises of appreciation. "My word, you humans have come a long way since I was around. I confess, I haven't the slightest idea what you're doing." The professor grabbed a towel and rubbed the board frantically. "I sometimes wonder myself, Your Majesty, now if you'll excuse me." "Oh, this is all so exciting," the Whangdoodle lisped happily. "I can't tell you how I appreciate this effort. So much seems to be happening. Have you seen my slippers?" He lifted a foot to show the professor. "I lost the pink ones just a while ago, and look what's growing already. Aren't they sensational? Silver and gold, bells on. I've never grown bells before. I can only surmise that it's due to my anticipation." The professor put both hands on his head. "Your Majesty, I really do have to concentrate." Yes, of course you do. Oh, goodness. I hope you will succeed. I can't eat, you know. I just can't. I must confess that even in the old days, when there were more of us, I seldom had the company of a lady Whangdoodle. The humans kept us busy. You see, at one time, they loved us very much, and we loved them. I'll tell you a secret. I miss them a great deal. It's been very lonely these past 500 years. You can understand my anxiety about the experiment." "I can, Your Majesty, but there won't be any experiment if I don't have a little peace and quiet." "Oh, yes, I was just going. Is there anything I can do?" "Just try to keep everyone away from the Great Hall for a while." I will. Sire, please don't get too excited. This may not work. I'm on to something, but it could fail," the professor cautioned. Come, a little perseverance." The Whangdoodle slapped the professor on the back. "Keep up the good work, but just know you can do it. You're a splendid fellow, splendid." He bounced to the door. "You will send for me the moment something happens." "Yes, Your Majesty." "You're really on to something." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Oh, I can't stand it. I may suffocate with excitement. I will leave you now. Pax amor lepus in il condo. Goodbye." "Goodbye." The professor turned away. The Whangdoodle popped his head around the door again. "One more thing." The professor sighed with exasperation. "That silly hat looks simply stunning on you." The Whangdoodle grinned and disappeared. The entire palace became a place of hushed expectation. The inhabitants crept around speaking in whispers, not daring to make a sound in case it disturbed the professor. The children spent a lot of time exploring. The proc showed them at the Whangdoodle's private apartment and the fabulous royal kitchens. There was a special pantry for watchmaking. "Is watch the only thing the Whangdoodle eats?" Lindy asked. "Good heavens, no." replied the Proc. He adores olives. He'll eat them by the ton. Once in a while, he'll take a piece of broccoli as well. Broccoli? Oh, gross, Lenny grimaced. The children discovered that the head chef in the kitchen was none other than the Oink. They watched him make a fresh batch of waj. He looked very efficient in his tall chef's hat, but he sang mournfully, "Sweets for a sweet tooth, confections for royal. Put it in the saucepan and leave it there to boil." The Proc patted the Oink on the shoulder. "Keep up the good work. His Majesty is delighted with the cooking." He winked at the children and whispered, "He is awfully vague at times, but there's not a better watchmaker in the country." The Oink said solemnly, "Watch out for yesterday. I'll catch up with you every time." The children learned how the palace was organized. The household chores were carried out by hundreds of penguin-like creatures called jiffies. There were always frantically running about the palace and seemed terribly busy. The Proc explained that it was not in a jiffy's nature to walk, which is why they made such efficient help. You see, they get things done in half the time, and then that leaves them plenty of time to play, which is something they love to do. The other important members of the palace staff were the little flurry flukes. They were couriers for the Whangdoodle, ran errands, and generally made themselves useful. Tom asked if he could visit the Wiffle Bird. He found her curled up on a pillow in a small, cheerful room. She looked tiny and fragile, and her colors were dull as she lay listless and alone. But the moment she saw Tom, she brightened considerably. "Hello, Wiffle Bird. We've all been so worried about you. How are you feeling?" She fluffed out her feathers and began to make small crooning noises. Tom knelt down and stroked her fondly. He saw the tiny hands come through the waving plumes and black button eyes staring out at him. "I do hope you'll be well enough to get out and about soon. It's lonely without you, you know." His words seemed to work wonders, for she began to strut up and down and behave much like her old self. "I'll come back and visit again, if you promise to get well soon. Is that a deal?" At this, she seemed very content and settled back in a corner to rest. Tom left the room feeling much happier. After worrying so much about the Wiffle Bird, it was good to know that she was on the road to recovery. The Whangdoodle sent for the children often, and they spent long hours with him. They were wonderful hours, for he was the most gracious and fun-loving host. He was thrilled and stimulated by their visits, yet at times his mind was obviously elsewhere. Under the circumstances, it wasn't hard to guess that His Majesty was most anxiously waiting to hear from the professor. The weather seemed very cloudy and still. Late one afternoon, it began to rain slowly at first, large drops splashing against the crystal walls and running down in shimmering rivulets. The wind rose and the rain came down harder. The Proc hurried into the salon where the Whangdoodle was having tea and waj with the children. There was a rumble of thunder overhead. The Proc spoke with restrained excitement. "Your Majesty, it hasn't rained in years. Not like this. You know what that could mean." I know, my good fellow. I was thinking the same thing myself." The Whangdoodle began to tremble and rose unsteadily to his feet. "Oh, my goodness, do you suppose that?" He gulped and was unable to finish the sentence. The Proc seemed to be listening for something. "In olden days, we believed that a storm such as this was an omen. Something out of the ordinary is going to happen. I'm quite sure of it." The thunder rumbled once more, and the wind chimes in the courtyard sang an eerie song. Over the sound came another sound, a faint chattering noise that brought the children to their feet as it grew louder and louder. The Proc strode to the big double doors and flung them open. The noise was almost deafening. Running towards him down the corridor were all the members of the royal household. They were chattering and tripping and falling over each other in their haste and excitement. The jiffies were screaming, "It's done! Your Majesty! It's done! It's done! It's done!" "Come and see! Come and see!" cried the little flukes. They tugged at the Whangdoodle slippers. "Hurry, Your Majesty!" Sidewinders thrashed through the crowd, waving their trunks in the air and yelling, "The professor says to come straight away!" "Yes, yes, straight away!" everybody shouted at once. Ben cried in triumph, "He's done it! He's done it!" The Whangdoodle turned bright red and leaned momentarily against the proc. He clutched his stomach. Then, regaining control, he began to gallop towards the great hall. The Jiffies and the Sidewinders and the Flukes fell back to allow him room. But the moment he had passed, the vast, strong, closed ranks and followed after him. Tom, Ben, and Lindy found themselves being swept along. In their excitement, they unashamedly pushed and shoved until they were at the head of the crowd and close behind the Whangdoodle. He skidded to a halt just inside the doors of the great hall. As abruptly as the noise had begun, it died. In the hushed, expectant silence, a weary and exhausted Professor Savant walked forward to greet the Whangdoodle. "Your Majesty," he said, and the children knew that it was hard for him to control excitement. "There is someone I would like for you to meet." He stepped to one side. A gasp of astonishment rose from the crowd. Seated on a white silk cushion in the center of the room, looking at everyone with much curiosity, was a smaller, daintier, and undeniably feminine replica of the Whangdoodle. She was the color of a fawn. Her eyes were large and soft with long, curling lashes. On her head were small antlers, and she wore a crown. Her front hooves were crossed delicately on the pillow, and her back toes were covered by the pair of tiny satin slippers. She was breathtakingly beautiful. She caught sight of the king and blinked with surprise, and then smiled to reveal one sweet tooth with a daisy on it. In a voice that suggested the softest murmurings of a heart, she whispered, "Unbelievable-dum-dum." The Whangdoodle stood absolutely still, momentarily stunned. He turned every color of the rainbow, then his legs buckled beneath him, and he fainted. Part 3, Conquest, Chapter 8. The great hall was cleared in readiness for a celebration. As miraculously as it had been turned into a laboratory, it now turned into a banquet hall. Lanterns and banners and silk canopies and ribbons were brought in. Tables and chairs were set for a tremendous feast. The royal gold and silver was polished until it shone brighter than ever before. Flowers were gathered. Great and exotic dishes were prepared. The Whangdoodle had ordered the greatest party in the history of Whangdoodle Land, and the palace staff intended to see that he got it. The king was beside himself with happiness, and the entire country rejoiced with him. Lindy was concerned about a dress when the subject of a party was first suggested. "I don't have anything to wear," she cried in dismay. "I can't go to a party in these old clothes." The Whangdoodle put her at ease. He commissioned a dress of ambrosia flowers for her, with a band of flutterby silk for her hair. New clothes were fashioned for the professor and the boys, and each was given a handsome cape for the occasion. By sunset, everything was ready, and the excitement in the palace was intense. The Splinter Cat was first to arrive. He bounded into the great hall with a tremendous enthusiasm and seemed genuinely pleased to see Lindy. He had brushed his silky fur until it shone. He wore a diamond bracelet around his tail. The Whifflebird was well enough to join the party and for most of the evening stayed close to Tom. The Oink came from the kitchen, and for a change he looked quite cheerful. He wore a smart frilly hat, which kept falling over his eyes. The Sidewinders wore their dress uniforms with bright red shoes and golden stockings on their 10 legs. The Proc surprised everyone. He arrived at the party looking resplendent in an embroidered frock coat and a silver Tripoli hat, and carrying a long jeweled staff. "You really do look like a prime minister," Ben said. The Proc actually blushed. "Oh, this old thing. I haven't taken it out of the cupboard for at least 200 years. Lindy's flowers dress was a triumph. Tom said candidly that she had never smelled so nice. The boys were handsome in their new capes, and the professor looked particularly dashing. The Whangdoodle had presented him with a gold laurel wreath, which sat with distinction on his venerable head. He had tucked his new crimson corduroy trousers into his purple socks, and of course, he wore the cape and the special ring that the Whangdoodle had given him. By the time every Jiffy and Fluke had been packed into the hall, The place was filled to capacity. At the appropriate moment, the proc moved to a velvet-covered platform at the far end of the room, where there were two golden chairs. Above them hung a silken canopy and a burnished shield with the words Pax Amor et Lepos in Io Condo. The proc banged his staff for attention, and his voice rang through the hall. Citizens of Whangdoodle Land, honored guests, your attention, please. It is with the greatest pleasure that I present to you His Majesty the King and his lovely Queen. The entire congregation sank to their knees, and there was a sigh of delight as the royal couple entered. The Whangdoodle's antlers were adorned with royal jewels, and he glittered and sparkled like a Christmas tree. His shy and enchanting bride wore a simple diamond coronet. Everyone cheered. Love and happiness filled the beautiful room. The proc danced with Lindy. Ben was an instant success with the female jiffies. They thought him most handsome and plied him with sweets and paid him so much attention that he became quite embarrassed. Lindy was asked to sing, and she happily complied. Her sweet voice pleased everyone, and the Splinter Cat obligingly put his head in the punch bowl to keep from howling. The Whangdoodle spent every second with his bride. He was unashamedly in love and very keen to impress her. At one point, his exuberance got the better of him, and he turned every color of the rainbow while dancing cabrioles, banging his new slippers together. Lindy said, Your Majesty, you're changing colors. Is that flange? Yes, flange, flange, flange. The king yelled at the top of his voice. It's surprisingly simple this evening. Can't think why. The grand ball continued long into the night. Everyone agreed that there had never been such a party. The doors of the palace were opened, and dancing couples spilled out into the crystal courtyards and waltzed beneath a sparkling starry sky. The professor sat quietly beside the royal couple and watched them proudly. The Whangdoodle moved over to speak with him. My good friend, my dear, dear professor, he lisped affectionately, how can I ever thank you for what you have done? You have given me all that my heart desired. I'm glad, Your Majesty. That makes me very happy. Remember that your wife will need a lot of care. She is still fragile and needs to gain strength. Have you decided on a name for her yet? I thought I'd leave that choice to you. Will you do me the honor? Will you do me the honor and think of something pretty? We intended to have a quiet christening in a couple of days. The professor thought about it. I think that I would like the Queen to be named something simple. She is the very essence of what my work is all about, and I am most proud of the achievement. How about Clarity? Splendid, lovely name, Claire for short. The Whangdoodle turned to his wife and said, My dear, the professor has thought of a perfect name for you. You are to be christened Clarity. The little Whangdoodle looked at the king and murmured, Humble-dee-dum-dum-dum. The Whangdoodle immediately turned crash pink. The professor smiled. What does that word mean, Your Majesty? It is a special term of endearment known to the Whangdoodles. The professor smiled. Sire, this is one very, very important thing that I would like to discuss with you, and that is the children in the matter of their hats, the scrappy caps. It is imperative that you give them back to me. The Whangdoodle looked uncomfortable. Couldn't we talk about that tomorrow? I'm afraid not. You see, tomorrow we simply must be on our way. Bother, the Whangdoodle fell silent for a moment. He looked up. I don't want you to go, you know. Bother, the Whangdoodle fell silent for a moment. He looked up. I don't want you to go, you know. Oh, Your Majesty, we don't want to go either. I know that it will somehow get out that you came to see me. That will be the beginning of the end. Life is so wonderful now. There's more reason than ever for me to protect it. The king looked worried and dispirited. I don't see how I can possibly let you go. But, sire, to think of the children and their family. It would be unfair and not at all like you if you refused to allow them to go home. It is important that they continue to live their lives and they were meant to live as they were meant to live them. Consider how you would feel if you were separated from your wife and were unable to see her again. Oh, my goodness. The king turned white. I do see what you mean, but humans aren't to be trusted, are they? Might I suggest you start learning to trust again, Your Majesty? You used to in the old days. Why would any of us want to spoil life for you? We'd be destroying the very thing we've come to appreciate and love. I shall miss you. The Whangdoodle's eyes grew moist, and he blinked several times. We will miss you. We will miss you too. Will you come back and visit? The professor spoke sincerely. You have only to send the word. Yes, good. The Whangdoodle beckoned to the Proc. Proc, old boy, fetch the hats and scrappy caps. The breakfast and the children will be having leaving in the morning. Also, have the jolly boat brought up. I want to escort them home. Everyone turned out to see them off. It was a sparkling, fresh morning. The jolly boat moved down the Golden River with the professor and the children of the Proc and the Whangdoodle aboard. Clarity stayed behind at the palace in order to rest for her royal christening. The children felt mixed emotions of happiness and sadness. It was good to be going home, but sad to be saying goodbye. They brightened, however, when the professor revealed that the Whangdoodle had extended an invitation to come and visit again another day. As they sailed along, they made good use of the royal soda fountain. Having eaten their fill, the children reflected on all the exciting things they had done and the wonders they had seen. Lindy looked at the mountains and remembered the Giascutus and wondered how she had ever managed to pluck up enough courage to cross the bridge for the professor. Ben saw the Needle Rock and thought how narrowly they had missed being caught by the Splinter Cat. Tom recalled his valiant dash to catch up with the brain strain. Each child concluded that every danger, every challenge had finally been worthwhile. The Whangdoodle was deep in conversation with the professor. I'm going to tell you a secret, he confided. The Proc said never to tell anyone, but I want to tell you. When all the other Whangdoodles disappeared so many hundreds of years ago, it was because humanity chose to forget them. The only reason I was able to stay alive in those dreadful times because I was certain that somebody somewhere still believed in me. I thought you might like to know how good it feels to have my faith justified after all these years. The professor was so touched. He was unable to reply. The Whangdoodle continued, I don't suppose you could stay on, could you? I understand about the children having to go, but couldn't you stay? I'm afraid not, Your Majesty. There's a lot of work for me to finish. I was just thinking that I could use your advice. I mean, I've never been married before. I hope I'll be able to look after Claire properly. Be a wise husband and everything. I don't think you'll have any problems, Your Majesty. Just love her very much, and she so obviously loves you, and you'll find the answers. Never fear. The jolly boat pulled into its mooring on the bland land's plain. The children and the professor said their goodbyes. It was a sad moment. There was a sudden flurry of feathers, and the wiffle bird appeared out of nowhere and flew straight into Tom's shoulders. She screamed, Mayday! Right in his ear. What is it, wiffle bird? What is it? He gasped. She made frantic little sounds and hung on to his jacket. The Proc stepped forward and said wisely, It is because you are leaving. Come along, wiffle bird. Thomas will be back another day. Of course I will, said Tom bravely. He lifted her off his shoulders and handed her gently to the Proc. Now, you take care of yourself, dear wiffle bird. I'll see you soon. He turned away so that she could not see his distress. The professor glanced at the children, then looked at the Whangdoodle. He gave a meaningful nod of farewell. The children suddenly felt the world beginning to spin, and the familiar dazzling lights surrounded them. Almost immediately, they found themselves back in the professor's garden. The professor said quietly, You'd better hurry on home. Ethel will be waiting for you. Liddy flung her arms about him. Oh, Professor, thank you for the best time ever. It was wonderful. Will we see you soon? Yes, I'll be here from time to time, though Washington will be my base. It's not going to be the same without you, said Ben. Good heavens, you can't have life handed to you on a platter every day, said the professor. That would be very boring, and there'd be no satisfaction in it. You shouldn't be needing me at all for a while. You've learned your lessons well. Look around you. Don't you see things differently now? The children gazed at the garden and the familiar house and the sky above and realized they were aware of every detail, every color, every texture. It was hard to believe that there had ever been a time when they had not seen the world with the same clarity. The professor put his arms around them and said firmly, Listen to me. You have all the tools, all the equipment necessary to make your own world as wonderful as the Whangdoodle land. So how about trying? If you set a enough example, you could start a fashion. Think of the favor you'd be doing the Whangdoodle. He might be persuaded to visit one day. He might just stay around if we all tried hard enough. It's up to each and every one of us. Now be off with you. I love you, and I will write a long letter from Washington. Epilogue. It felt good to be home. Mr. and Mrs. Potter returned on Sunday, and Mrs. Potter cooked a delicious evening meal. Mr. Potter said, "Well, how was your vacation? Did you miss us?" "The professor gave us a lovely time, but yes, we did miss you," said Ben. "How's Grandma?" asked Lindy. "She's much better, darling. She knitted you these pretty slippers." Mrs. Potter handed Lindy a pair of pink woolen slippers with floppy tassels on them. Lindy gasped in surprise. "Why, they're almost exactly like the Whangdoodles," she blurted out. "The what?" Mrs. Potter looked puzzled. The telephone rang, and Mr. Potter got up to answer it. Ben nudged Lindy fiercely under the table. He said evenly, "The professor was telling us about a funny creature in olden times that was supposed to grow slippers. Is that the creature you were looking up in the dictionary a few weeks ago?" "Yes." Ben glanced at Tom. The conversation was getting out of hand. Mrs. Potter began to clear the dishes for the table. "Did you ever find out if it existed or not?" There was a long pause. Ben stammered, "The professor said it was up to us to decide." Fortunately, it ended there because Mr. Potter walked excitedly into the room. "Frida, that was the university on the phone. The most amazing thing has happened. You know all the equipment that was stolen from the laboratory? Well, it's been returned, every single piece. It must have been a student hoax, dear." "It must have been." Mr. Potter sat down by the fire and opened the Sunday paper. "Fetch my pipe, will you, Tom? Did the professor say anything to you, Ben, about the theft? It was his stuff that was stolen, you know." "No, sir." It's very odd. Ah, here's a photograph of your friend in the paper. I see he's going to Washington as a special scientific advisor to the president. Well, let's hope he does some good." "Oh, I'm certain he will, Dad," Ben said with a smile. Mr. Potter frowned. "This work he's doing, this genetics thing, I'm not sure I like the idea. In the final analysis, I wonder if it'll be good for mankind." Ben felt a sudden, tremendous need to communicate with his father. "Well, whether we like it or not, I think genetics is here to stay, Dad, and it could be the answer to a lot of things." He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "We will have a tremendous responsibility on our hands. If we're going to play God, we must try to do it with honor and decency." Edwin Potter stared at his son. Then he said quietly, "Ben, you're growing up. Those are very wise remarks, and you're absolutely right." Ben felt a warm glow of happiness at his father's praise. I think the professor helped me think it out," he explained. Mrs. Potter took up her knitting. Professor, that's the only word I ever hear," she admonished gently. "Will you ever stop talking about that man, I wonder?" The children looked at each other. "Oh, I don't think so," they all answered exactly at the same moment.